the two corrupt agents were not only stealing from the site, but they were experts in crypto technology. They had the ability to change passwords, PIN numbers, chats on the forum and the marketplace. They could act as many aliases, including Dread Pirate Roberts, who Ross supposedly was the only one. They had all kinds of abilities to tamper with this evidence that the jury was shown. And yet the jury wasn't allowed to know they even existed until after the trial. And the defense said, well, wait, we'll just postpone. They said, oh, well, we have to do our investigation. We don't want to alert these agents. And the defense said, okay, let's wait. We'll have a fair trial later. And the judge wouldn't allow that. And then it turned out they already knew they were under investigation. They'd been interviewed by law enforcement. So it was such a, travesty. And, the Brady rule says you're not allowed to hide evidence that is exculpatory, that the jury is allowed to know and things that are helpful to the defendant. And they didn't know a thing about it.
It's absolutely remarkable. I mean, there's on its face that deserves a complete. I mean, that is a mistrial. There's no way around it. I think so too.
Yeah. Well, the appellate court in New York didn't agree.
And as you say, there's now evidence for a third agent that deleted a bunch of information. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. After trial, the defense they loaded 6 terabytes of discovery evidence onto the defense pre-trial. That's a lot of material to go through. And so they didn't, wasn't capable of doing it all. But they continued after trial and came across an obscure folder that had the material between DPR and someone called Not Wonderful, who said he was a law enforcement agent and wanted to sell DPR information, which DPR agreed to pay him for. And there was another folder showing payments. This file was complete. What was in the evidence that was shown to the jury had a whole big part truncated, totally deleted, that indicated this corruption. And there it was. And if that hidden file had not been discovered, no one would be the wiser. And deleted. The thing about digital evidence is there's no fingerprints, there's no witnesses. You cannot forensically prove something's been tampered with. The other thing that was found during the same discovery was this login by using the Dread Pirate Roberts account 7 weeks after Ross was in prison. We don't know, it only shows the last login, so we don't know how many times this person logged in, how many of them there were, how long it had been going on, but it's there. Now, this is not part of the appeal because this was not brought out in the trial because we didn't know about it. And so it would take another trial to have this come out. But
which, again, seems like a travesty of justice.
Yeah. And the defense had a press conference about it and wrote the government about it and has the information. It's not, I'm not just saying it. It's there. But you have to go through the legal steps.
All right. Well, unfortunately, there is even worse news that has come out recently, obviously relating to the appeal of that conviction. Can you tell us about the news?
Well, the appellate court, the Second Circuit, completely denied the entire appeal, the convictions, the part about the corrupt agents, the sentence. So that was devastating, frankly. I thought that they would at least give him another chance at a sentence because so many people were outraged at the sentence. And it's not just for Ross. There's so many, as I said, nonviolent people who haven't physically hurt anyone. And I'm not saying, look, you can make an argument for sentencing, but life for nonviolent crimes is just, and there's no parole. There's no chance at redemption. There's no chance to make restitution. You're done. You are sealed away for life to die. And these are people who aren't violent. I didn't think they'd do it. And they even said, well, we might not have given that sentence, but it was under her discretion, so we can't change it. So then the next step is to appeal the appeal, which is petition for a rehearing. We hear that the Second Circuit very, very rarely rehears anything. And it's kind of like winning the lottery, but you try. And then the next step that's available is to submit a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court on whatever issues, you want them to hear. So the climb gets steeper and steeper. It's very difficult because 10,000 petitions are entered and submitted to the Supreme Court, and they take about 85 of them.
Again, like winning a lottery of sorts.
Yeah.
Well, and I understand that Ross has been moved from the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, where he was being held. Where has he been moved to?
Well, and he was held there longer than normal because he wanted to be near his lawyers because he doesn't have email privileges and wanted to be able to work on the appeal. But so it's really a transitional facility, and which is why he hardly ever got outside at all, because it's very contained. It's in Manhattan. But now he's been moved. He's in a processing center is what they do, and they send them to Oklahoma. And he's like, wow, it's so spacious. It's really, he's like, wow, it's not a closet, But he's been, as far as we know, he'll be designated to Florence, USP in Colorado, which, not to the Supermax, which is like the most serious Supermax in the system, but to a high security. He doesn't, I was just reading over before the show, all the criteria for being in a lower security prison, which he meets all of them, nonviolent, all the different things. No, none of these offenses, but because this judge gave him such a long sentence, all of those get swept aside, and he has to be in a high security, even though he poses no threat to anyone because of this sentence.
Wow.
And of course, they're much more dangerous places. I'm very concerned about his safety. Things happen in maximum security prisons. Ross is not violent. Yes. He's a totally peaceful guy, and I am concerned.
Well, not to add to the concern, but even the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City is, will be familiar to my listeners as the place where Kenneth Michael Trenadu met his untimely end at the hands of federal authorities.
Oh, really?
So, it's...
Whoa, well, okay, I didn't know about that.
Yes, it is not a happy
That's where
picture.
Ross is right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it is just a terrible case in every way imaginable. And of course, if the intent is to send the message from the government to people out there generally that, just using Ross as a figurehead, that if you talk about agorism, if you talk about trying to use Bitcoin, if you talk about in any way trying to exist outside of the system we have constructed for you, look what we have in store. It's a very, very scary message for them to be sending, and I'm sure that there are people listening to that message. What has
Let
been...
me just say real quick for that, because there's a criminal defense attorney, Scott Greenfield, who wrote in his blog, he goes, that's why he got the sentence, because he had the hubris to think that he could create a virtual agora outside government control. That's why. Because the drug sentences with the Silk Road offenders, the longest one is 10 years. It's not about drugs. It's about an idea. It's about privacy. It's about Bitcoin. Chuck Schumer, who's behind it, was on the Senate Finance Committee, and I believe Bitcoin was very alarming to them. It's about those things. It's the sensationalism around it, and you were very perceptive because when you right at the beginning said, "Wait a minute, there's a bigger picture here," and saw right past all of sensationalism. Very few people did. So to your credit, because that's exactly what it is. And so anyway, it's about, you better not create an agora. You better not, because, and Ross is like the head on the spike of the medieval castle. That's what's going to happen to you. Now, it doesn't work, apparently, but that's what they're doing.
Well, Ross...
And I thought we were supposed to be judged as individuals, not to be made some kind of sacrificial lamb.
Yes, exactly. Well, Ross is a political prisoner. I don't think there's any two ways around that.
Absolutely.
Has he made any mention of that? Has he talked about that aspect of this?
Well, I believe agrees. We don't, we haven't talked a lot about that. I believe he thinks that, that he feels like he's been treated very unfairly and that he's dying to tell his story himself because he feels like the media has distorted it terribly, that the trial distorted it, and he wants to be able to say who he is. He wanted to testify at trial. He wanted to be open and communicate, and was advised not to, and still has been, because, you know, Ross is, when you read about him in the media and then you know him, there's such a disconnect. But it's also, he wants to talk, basically he's saying what he had in mind was privacy and voluntary interaction. That's what he cared about. Ross didn't care about drugs. He didn't really care about making a ton of money or any of that, kingpin and all that. That's not who he is. So we've talked about all that. Yeah.
Well, speaking of media smears and Kingpin, I have read American Kingpin by Nick Bilton, so you don't have to. I don't recommend people go out and buy the book, but at any rate, I have read it. Would you like to respond to any of Bilton's reporting in that work of non-fiction, quote unquote?
Yeah, well, Nick Bilton was very much wanted me to be involved in that book, and I was warned by someone who knew that it was going to be the government narrative. And the same person told me that Bilton and the people involved told him that the government supplied them with material a year before trial. They fed them their version. So I believe, since the government couldn't convict Ross of murder for hire themselves, they got Bilton to do it for them. And he bases the whole thing on this is true. It's not even proven. The excerpts I've read have shown distortion about things I personally know about, where, things like, he lived in a basement and he owned the house where the basement was a finished basement. He owned the house, Ross owned the house, and he rented rooms upstairs in college. It wasn't like he was some strange troglodyte living in a basement, that kind of thing. Yeah, okay, he lived in it. And there's a lot of this sort of distortion and sensationalizing that creates, I guess, a good movie treatment. I haven't read the book.
Yes, please
it's
don't.
Too painful for me to read. I really don't want to read it.
It really is upsetting in a lot of ways, specifically because, of course, it's written like a novel or something, where he puts you in the minds of the characters as if he knows what they're thinking at a moment-to-moment basis. It's ridiculous, but very effective, I'm sure. I'm sure a lot of people will read that and come away quite convinced that they know what they know about the case. At any rate, there's a lot.
That's problem being fed to the public. That's what happens. If you really want to dig into this, it's work. It's much more sensationalizing and kind of exciting to,
Of course.
Anyway, well, that's interesting to hear your response.
Well, indeed.
Because that's what I got from research,
Well, again, I just don't want people putting any money in the pockets of Bilton or his ilk. So don't buy the book. At any rate, there's so much that we should and could talk about here. I would like to finish up by talking about your own experience of this politically, in terms of your own awareness of or activism in the realm of agorism or the agora. What was your own understanding of this before any of this happened, and what is it now?
I would say I lean towards entrepreneur. My husband and I are entrepreneurs. We lean toward please leave us alone. When Ross was supporting Ron Paul, I certainly didn't disagree with anything there. So it wasn't a huge leap for me in that sense. But my eyes have really been opened by seeing up close and personal how the government operates. And I have been shocked and I have been alarmed. And the precedents that are being set with this, people really need to understand this isn't just about Ross and me and the case. There are very serious precedents being set with this case that will trickle down into the courts in the future. And we're at a tipping point in history right now. And the courts are grappling with how to deal with all of these things. And, the idea of vicarious liability where you can blame someone for someone else's actions, the use of digital evidence to put someone away for life when a mortgage company won't even take a screenshot of a bank statement. That court has a lower standard of evidence than a mortgage company. Or, the use of corruption, of course, or the preclusion of the corruption. But there's so many precedents that will impact all of us. The privacy aspect, there's so many. And I realized more and more as I was propelled into this, how this is so much bigger and how we live in serious times, and I'm very concerned about it. And so I do feel that it's a bigger mission. I do want to have my son free. I desperately do. But it's also a bigger cause for me now. And the people that I've met through this, there's some amazing people, you know, I think we're in a very important struggle right now. And I think we're in danger of losing our freedom, and we need to, I really want people to wake up about it.
Well, if you want to know what the government is afraid of, just look at the way they treat people like Ross. So clearly, agorism is something that they do fear, and that's a message that I'm sure my audience will be receptive to, as it's something that I talk about quite a bit. So people who want to help you in your mission, in the appeal of the appeal, and in the outreach generally that you do at freeross.org, how can people support that mission?
Well, there's all kinds of ways on freeross.org. Of course, one of the ways the government crushes individuals is to bankrupt them, basically. It's very, very expensive, so we always need financial help. But also, if you have connections, if you have ideas, you can reach me through that website on the contact page. Just email me. I see all the emails. And you know, any kind of connections to get the word out, to spread the word, to help us on social media to spread the word, to counteract this narrative that's being, that Ross is being smeared with as a person, as well as to point out the importance of the issues that will affect us all. So there's lots of ways, lots of different levels, and we really appreciate the support we've gotten, tremendous support, and do need it. We're one family, and so thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, as you say, this is about so much more than one individual or one family, but you are shouldering so much of the brunt of this. So I really do hope that people will go and help out what they can in whatever way they can, even just spreading information about freeross.org and about the work that you're doing there, because again, this does affect everyone one way or another in the long run. All right, Lynn Ulbricht, thank you very much for your time. I certainly do hope that we can have you on again in the future to talk about further developments.
That'd be great. Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate it.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by you. Your support makes the Corbett Report possible. Sign up for the subscriber newsletter or purchase a DVD at corbettreport.com/support. Our allies are in combat.
You have destroyed all of the elementals in the surrounding area. Your penchant for violence is impressive. You must send your armies to support me so I can decimate this rebellion. Rebels have an entrenched position up ahead. You must destroy their encampment if I am to end this farce. I follow. Essence falls. I follow. Watchful. All things change.
Our allies are in combat.
I take essence.
Our allies are in combat. Our forces are under attack.
Time to change. Aemon sends reinforcements to support his champion. Prepare to meet them in combat. I
enemy has mobilized. We should move to intercept.
I take essence. Essence flows. I follow.
Oblivion awaits Amon's minions. Maintain your psionic support, and I shall deliver. These hybrids possess immense psionic power. Destroy them, or that power will belong to their champion.
Essence. Rise, primal. Change.
Our forces are under attack.
I take essence. I must change.
Our
Eat your
allies are
food.
in
Eat
combat.
your food.
Essence. I follow. I listen.
Evolution completed.
And so ends our shield. What a pathetic display. When the day comes, I hope Alarat proves to be a more fitting challenge.
where I have a problem with the all-out libertarian argument of anything goes, is we live in a world where everything you do affects someone else.
I consider this book a media lynching. Nick Bilton bases his so-called true story on allegations that have never been proven.
Lynn Ulbricht is the mother of Ross Ulbricht, a former Eagle Scout from Austin, Texas, and a libertarian idealist who created the Silk Road, an online marketplace on the dark web that was used to buy drugs, weapons, and other illegal goods. A self-taught programmer, Ulbricht built this anonymous e-commerce site with the goal of undermining the drug war by moving illicit commerce online where the government would be powerless to stop it. The site was a wild success, and Ross amassed tens of millions of dollars in Bitcoin operating it. After an exhaustive search for his identity by federal law enforcement agencies, Ross was arrested in San Francisco in 2013 and sentenced to life without parole. He's currently in the same New York federal prison that houses the notorious Mexican cartel kingpin El Chapo Guzman. A new book by former New York Times columnist and Vanity Fair special correspondent Nick Bilton tells the gripping story of the manhunt for Ross Ulbricht and the so-called Dread Pirate Roberts, a pseudonym used by the Silk Road's chief operator and a nod to the cult classic The Princess Bride, in which the Dread Pirate Roberts is a name passed down from one character to another.
Nick Bilton has appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner.
Lynn Ulbricht maintains that her son wasn't the Dread Pirate Roberts, a theory that the judge disallowed in the trial and that Bilton didn't include in the book. I sat down with Bilton to discuss the book, whether Ross Ulbricht was the only person to act under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, and to get his personal opinion about his enigmatic protagonist.
I came at it from a viewpoint of wanting to understand how Ross felt and why he wanted to do this. I didn't know if it was monetary, I didn't know if it was libertarian, I didn't know what it was. And so I really wanted to understand, and that was probably the most important thing to me in the beginning of this reporting process. He had joined the Libertarian Club in college, and he had libertarian-leaning views prior to that, but at Penn State. So I ended up talking to people who he was in the club with. I talked to people he met at conferences, libertarian conferences. I saw some of the transcripts from some of the debates he'd done, some of the quotes he'd given the local college newspaper, and spoke to people that he had debated with. And his arguments are incredibly relatable. You know, he argues, you know, very succinctly, okay, why is it that people are thrown in jail for buying weed or magic mushrooms? When it comes to that, I think I completely agree with Ross and his arguments and his ideas. Where I started to have a really hard time was with the idea of selling of things like heroin and fentanyl, which have led to more deaths in the last year alone than people who have been killed from firearms. I don't see those as drugs, I see them as poisons. And one of the things I really tried to do in the book is I don't offer a viewpoint at any point in time. What I do is I tell Ross's side in the chapters about Ross, from his point of view, from the things that I've read and reported and so on, and then I tell the law enforcement side from their point of view. And of course there's different versions of the law enforcement side. And I want the reader to decide at the end. Do they believe that what Ross did was right? Do they believe it was wrong? Do they believe drugs should be legal? Do they not? And I really hope that that's how it comes across.
You get a little uncomfortable with things like heroin or fentanyl being sold on there, and certain people, certain characters in the book also seem uncomfortable with that who are affiliated with the website. But the other side of that would be, well, still better here where there's some sort of customer review process. There's education happening on the forums to tell people how to take the drugs more safely. So, and also just the side effect of prohibition, all the violence that happens just because something that people want is prohibited. In the end, how do you think that all shook out?
I think that with all technology, whether it's the Silk Road, Twitter, Facebook, driverless cars, you name it, with all technology, there is a good side and a bad. And I think that one of the biggest problems in Silicon Valley, which is something I've covered for over a decade, is that people never, ever think about the bad. They always think about the good. And the bad is something that happens, and then they have to kind of clean up the pieces afterwards. For example, you know, I was friends with the guys who built some of the early 3D printers, MakerBot and things like that. And I remember saying, what are you going to do with this? This is really cool. You can print objects out. And they said, oh, we're going to make wall hooks and iPhone cases. What was the first thing that people did was they built 3D printed guns. Put aside the libertarian argument of that, whether guns should be legal or whatever. If there was something that they had thought about, they could have thought about ways to ensure that a 5-year-old didn't do that, or whatever it is. And I think the same thing happened with the Silk Road. You know, there are surveys and studies that came out in the past few years that have showed that buying drugs online makes people feel safer, makes them feel like they know what they're buying because there were review systems. All the things that Ross set out to do.
Right.
But then there are the negatives, and the negatives are that, you know, it has allowed fentanyl to come into the country more. There are other ways that it has come into the country, but and people don't understand this is a lab-based heroin that's 50 to 100 times stronger, and people overdose on it. Where I have a problem with the all-out libertarian argument of anything goes is we live in a world where everything you do affects someone else, right? Every single solitary thing you do has an effect on another human being. And the way that I saw Ross arguing it, right, was that, well, that's not my problem.
The libertarian viewpoint on the drug war is that it itself is so harmful that something has to be done to overturn it, and it's not going to happen through normal democratic processes. It's been going on for over 40 years.
I completely agree.
$1 trillion, countless deaths, incarceration.
I completely 1,000% agree that the war on drugs did not work, is not working. And I think that what's fascinating is even the authorities that are chasing Ross in the book agree. You know, the DEA agent that ends up becoming a bad guy, he has a moment in the story where he's like, wait a second, maybe this guy's right. Maybe the war on drugs is broken. But the argument that Ross was trying to prove was that let's just make everything legal and it will work itself out. And I think that there are a lot of bad people in the world that try to take advantage of people by cutting up heroin with rat poison or whatever it is. And it kind of doesn't think about the repercussions of those bad people.
I want to ask about the rather large group of federal agents who hunted down Ulbricht.
Yeah.
That's a major part of this book. It's about that manhunt.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about the size and the scope of the investigation of Silk Road?
There's a DEA team in New York. There's an FBI team in New York. There's an IRS agent in New York. There's local police. There's people in San Francisco that don't even make it into the story. There are people overseas. You know, everyone is kind of hunting for this thing because, one, it was getting a tremendous amount of attention in the media because it was just fascinating that this thing existed and that no one had been caught and it hadn't been shut down. And two, it's because a lot of people wanted to be the hero that caught the guy. But at the same time, you see the dysfunction of government. No one wants to share their information because they're afraid that if they do, someone will steal it and go and catch this person. They won't get credit. There are, of course, people that do bad things. Carl Force, the DEA agent who starts stealing money and selling information to the Dread Pirate Roberts and all this insane stuff. There's Sean Bridges, the Secret Service guy who does the same thing and is literally stealing money. It's just mind-boggling just how dysfunctional this whole thing was.
Besides, you know, scrambling just out of pure ambition and media attention, there seemed to be, at least with some of these agents, almost ideological motivation. I mean, we talked about Ross's ideology, his libertarianism, but then there's this Homeland Security agent who reads the writings of the Dread Pirate Roberts, which is the screen name of the administrator of the Silk Road, and you describe him as being terrified at what he's reading. Could you talk about the ideological motivations of some of the people involved in this?
For some of the agents, for one in particular, Gary Alfred from the IRS, he sees the writings of the Dread Pirate Roberts and they're almost all incredibly anti-government, and he is working on a task force where there are people who on 9/11 had run down to the buildings and spent weeks down there trying to pull bodies out of the rubble, and he juxtaposes those two things and is livid, essentially, that these people are now going to the hospital and some have died because of what their heroic efforts on 9/11, and then the Dread Pirate Roberts calling everyone in the federal government, you know, not very nice things.
I also sensed some of that in the sentencing statement of the judge in this case, whose statements quite frankly infuriated a lot of Ulbricht's supporters. She gave a full-throated defense of drug prohibition. She said that his position was privileged and that what he did was terribly destructive to our social fabric. And then, I mean, threw the book at him. What do you make of the judge's comments and sentencing in this case?
Well, two things. The first thing I'll say is that from my reporting, Ross was actually offered a plea deal in the beginning when he was arrested in New York. And the plea deal was 10 to life. And it would not have charged him with the kingpin charge, which they said, okay, if you're going to go to court, we're throwing the kingpin charge at you, which is everything, which is a really bad charge.
I will throw in that offering a plea deal of 10 to life is, you know, I could see why someone might not jump on that.
I can see why someone might not jump on that, but when the amount of evidence that was on Ross's computer, it also boggles my mind why he decided to take it to court, and with the defense that he went with. He was caught with 2.1 million words of chat logs on his laptop, photos, videos, spreadsheets. All of the same stuff was on thumb drives separately in his computer. It was a very difficult case to argue. Putting that aside, one of the toughest questions I'm ever asked around this book is if I agree with the sentencing. And I can see it from both points of view. I can see people who look at it and say, it's ridiculous. It's 2 life sentences plus 40 years for running this website. And I completely understand that argument. It makes complete sense. The other point of view is that there were at least 6 people who overdosed and died as a result of the site. They got bad drugs or had a bad reaction. You can say that the murders didn't happen, but he thought that they were happening. And the argument from that side is, well, of course that was a just sentence. As far as what the judge said, and this is one of the things that really upsets me the most about this whole story. You know, this is a judge who not only hears cases like Ross Ulbricht's, but hears cases every single day from people in the Bronx and elsewhere that sell drugs because they don't really have many options. And what I took from her statement of that it was a privileged argument is that Ross had a very lucky upbringing. He had a family that loved him. He had a lot of opportunities. He went to school to be a physicist, and he chose to go down this path for the reasons he chose to go down. And his argument that it was different because it was from behind a computer, I think was what frustrated her the most. And what frustrates me the most is you have everyone out there defending Ross, but I don't see anyone out there defending all these poor people who are in jail for selling weed or magic mushrooms, who are African American and Hispanic.
Someone like Ross, who basically devoted his life to trying to stop the drug war from happening, and the people who support him, who deeply believe that the drug war is immoral and wrong, think that this was a tool that could have disrupted that. Obviously, they wanted to set an example of this guy who tried to do something to end this unjust drug war that throws all these poor people with these crazy sentences. To hear a federal judge who hands out those sentences sanctimoniously lecturing, I think, probably rubbed people the wrong way.
I cannot speak for the judge. I'm not the judge. If I was the judge, it probably would have been a different sentence. Definitely would have been a different sentence. But the everything goes mentality had repercussions. I don't agree with the sentencing for these mild drugs. I do not believe that they should be illegal. I really think it's just ridiculous. But when I see the results, I mean, go read the series in the Washington Post of people who have overdosed from fentanyl, and look at some of the stories and the videos of kids whose parents have died from it. It is harrowing. That shouldn't be legal as far as I'm concerned. Like, in my personal opinion.
The argument for making something like heroin or even fentanyl legal would be that at least if it's out in the open, we can treat the terrible consequences, the public health consequences, more effectively than when it's totally underground. And again, that something like the Silk Road would be a kind of crowbar to, pry legalization open.
I mean, I'm curious, do you believe that it should be legal? Do you believe that heroin, that fentanyl, that all of these things should just be kind of open and
I believe in harm reduction. I don't think that harm elimination is realistic, but I think that making everything legal makes it a lot easier for information about these things to get out there and for treatment programs to
But I
flourish.
also believe that there are certain things that. Do you believe cyanide should be legal? I personally see fentanyl and heroin is the same thing. It's not. These are not drugs that we should be taking. I mean, tens of thousands of people now die a year from those drugs.
In a world where drugs were totally illegal, who knows if fentanyl would even exist?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I think that again, like for me, it's not all or nothing. I do believe it literally just boggles my mind that magic mushrooms are illegal and that even weed is illegal, and MDMA and all these things. It just I don't understand. It just makes no sense. But when it comes to these hard drugs that people overdose from on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, I just don't understand why they exist, and I don't think that we should be encouraging people to take them.
Obviously, Ross is a sympathetic character to someone like me in a lot of ways, but there's one area of this story that even makes his supporters uncomfortable, which is the supposed murder for hires that happened. There was one that was completely staged by a DEA agent, the one who was siphoning bitcoins off the site.
Yeah.
There were supposedly 5 others that were the Hell's Angels were maybe contracted, or maybe it was some sort of scam. In any case, no bodies ever came up, and it was not ever used in court against Ulbricht.
Well, it was used in court against Ulbricht. He was not charged with murder, but the kingpin charge that was used both at the trial, chat logs around it, discussions around it, and it was used a lot in the sentencing.
Couldn't you make the argument that that's worse in a way, bringing it up in the trial, but not actually, feeling like you have enough evidence to charge him with it?
From what I can tell from the reporting I've done, the people I've spoken to, they didn't not charge the murders because they didn't have the evidence for the murders. They would never have charged him with murder. They would have charged him with some sort of commissioning to have someone killed or something like that, which is also a federal crime. But the reason is because they wanted to prove a point about the website, and that was why they went after that kingpin charge, from what I can tell. The point was, if you run a website like this, that these are going to be the repercussions for those actions. That was the government point of view. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying that that's what I heard during my reporting.
And there's been some criticism of the book from Ross Ulbricht's mother, Lynn, who's a very outspoken advocate. She's called the book a media lynching and says that you basically just presented the government's side of the case.
Nick Bilton has appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner.
Especially in relation to these commission murder charges, where the defense side of the argument is that the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was the administrator who ran the site, might have been Ross at one point, but he walked away.
It was always Ross.
But you don't buy that. Why don't you buy that?
Well, first of all, you read the book. Do you think it's a one-sided point of view from the government side?
I don't think that, but you don't raise this possibility that there might have been other people behind the DPR account.
Because there wasn't. There is not a shred of a doubt in my mind that Ross ran that site from day one. The evidence, it is overwhelming. And I don't need the government to tell me that. I went through everything. I went through 2.1 million words of chat logs. We went through social media posts, photos, videos, Ross in college arguing these things, saying the same exact things in college during debate class as the Dread Pirate Roberts said throughout the entire life cycle of the site. If you want to argue that the chat logs were hacked and changed, you would need a team of 1,000 people to pull that off. Imagine all you did for 3 years was talk online, and you didn't really have many conversations in person. Now imagine that you, at the same time as talking online to your coworkers, you're also posting on social media about things, right? So let's just say I have a few minutes while you're in the library and I hack into your computer and I'm going to place some documents there, right? How the heck am I going to get the minute when you're on a flight telling your employees that I'm going to be on a flight, when you're camping saying I'm going to be away this weekend, when you meet a girl telling people you just met a girl, to pull all those things off and to manipulate his social media, it would be impossible. If you read the book and you see how much of a mess the government was while trying to hunt this thing down, if you believe that the government could pull off manipulating all that stuff to throw this random kid in jail, it's beyond delusional.
But does it necessarily prove that there were not other people with access to the login? Because one of the main alternative theories out there was that Mark Karpelès, who founded the Bitcoin exchange Mt. Gox, whose assets were seized in another investigation leading up to this, might have been the Dread Pirate Roberts.
So you're trying to tell me that Mark Karpelès put together, manipulated those chat logs over almost 3 years, manipulated his social media feed, his emails, his text messages, the photos, right? Then, not only that, took the entire Silk Road that was the exact version that's on the laptop, snuck into Ross's bedroom, and put the thumb drives next to his bedside the same day he's arrested, and managed to get all those files on his computer in a library in a matter of about 4 or 5 minutes. It's impossible. And so I just don't believe for any moment that there was more than one Dread Pirate Roberts. I just don't, there's nothing that it implies that other than the fact of that brilliant name, the Dread Pirate Roberts.
The defense is working on an appeal right now for Ross, and a couple of the things they've revealed are that they say they've discovered some deleted conversations between the Dread Pirate Roberts and someone who might have been another corrupt agent in the investigation. They also say that someone seems to have logged into the DPR account after
Well,
Ross
the DPR forum
was
account, not the
arrested.
DPR account. If someone logged into the DPR account, they would have taken off all the money and run away. Someone logged into the DPR forum account, and from what I understand, it was about 7 weeks after and it was when the employees were taking the code from the site to build the Silk Road 2, and amid the code was a DPR forum login.
Given the complexities of this investigation and the nature of online identities and some of these anomalies, you still don't think there's any room for any uncertainty or doubt as to who was exactly behind the DPR account at all times?
I just don't have a shred of a doubt that it was Ross. When you read the chat logs from the point in time when he supposedly handed it off to someone else, there's no differentiation between them before and after, and the social media posts and so on. When I first started writing this book, I thought there were multiple Dread Pirate Roberts. I literally, when I first sat down and I started writing this book, I was like, okay, my job is to try to figure out who they are. And then I saw the evidence, and I saw the diaries on his computer, and even before I saw the chat logs, and it was just, it was the beginning of a bullet train that started to point in one direction.
And given the corruption that we know was involved with this case from people like Carl Force, you don't have any doubts about anything being falsified in there?
I believe that there were things falsified from Carl Force's DEA reports. I'm sure he was not a very honest person, but I don't believe that anyone got into Ross's computer and managed to put in thousands and thousands of documents related to the Silk Road. There's part of me that really, really wishes Ross would have said, I did this, I believe that the war on drugs is stupid and wrong, and I did it because I believe this, and become a martyr for the cause. The other part of this that was so fascinating to me is the technological part. You know, I meet people that will say on Twitter or Facebook, you're a piece of shit and go to hell and this, that, and the other. I'll meet them in person and they're the nicest, sweetest person in the world. We have a disassociation with what technology does and how it disconnects us from human beings. And even at Ross's sentencing, he apologized for the things that had happened. After the parents of the people who had died stood up and spoke, he says that he didn't intend for any of this to happen.
I want to finish talking about intentions versus reality because you make it very clear in the book that he did start out with the idea of like, I want my legacy to be the person who began the end of the war on drugs. The Silk Road is gone, it's been taken down, but as we know, dozens of imitators have popped up in its wake. What do you think
his legacy will be, and what will people have learned from the Ross Ulbricht case?
His legacy will be both good and both bad. I think that there will be a group of people, mostly the people watching this, who will see that he has, if not started the conversation about how technology can be used